The Cold War began with the violation of the Yalta Conference, such as not allowing self-determination of government in Poland and creating a communist buffer zone. Our three main themes of our video are détente, policy of containment, and arms and space race. Our main topics are 1. The Soviet Union, 2. China and Vietnam, and 3. Korea, Middle East, and Latin America. The outcomes of all these events are the failure of containment, as seen in Vietnam, North Korea, and China, a loss of power for the US, a loss of faith in domestic, as seen in the Second Red Scare, and an increase in funding for science and math education, as well as relaxed tension with communist countries.
Our overcoming event is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Did the US overcome brinksmanship? 1. The US pursues diplomacy rather than going straight into war as previously seen in the Korean War. 2. The US overcame direct conflict. 3. The US successfully pursued nuclear ban policies among nations. And 4. The US successfully pursued relaxed tensions. Did they meet the criteria? Yes, they did. 1. Because they pursued diplomacy rather than going straight to war despite brinksmanship. 2. They overcame a direct threat by pursuing diplomacy. 3. The US successfully established a pact with the Soviet Union prohibiting child nuclear explosions in late 1963. And 4. The pact led to a peaceful coexistence with Russia and therefore relaxed tensions, which led to détente.
After the disagreements at the Yalta Conference, the Soviet Union established its Iron Curtain, which was a barrier between the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. This symbolized the division between communist and anti-communist countries, their most formidable opponent being the US. The US then proceeded to contain communism to this area. This led to the US to establish containment principles that shaped foreign policies, such as the Truman Doctrine, which sent aid to governments in Greece resisting pressures from communist forces. There was also the Marshall Plan, which sent money to rebuild Western Europe to prevent communism. These led to the ideal that the US would try to stop communism all over the world. This would be their principal ideology that would shape foreign policy for the next 40 years until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Cold War was an arms and space race. The failure of containment, as seen in Korea, indirectly caused the Second Red Scare, as an American fear that Soviet spies were infiltrating the US and passing nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union, and the race to make an H-bomb existed at that time. At the same time, Russia's invention of the Sputnik, the first artificial Earth satellite, also fueled the Second Red Scare. This challenged US pride as people realized that the US was not as great as they thought. This fueled a competitive drive within the US, which led Congress to pass the National Defense Education Act to promote research and teaching in science, engineering, and foreign languages. There was also the creation of NASA and the pursuit of being the first country to reach the moon, which was ultimately fulfilled by the Apollo. Despite influencing the start of the Second Red Scare, the arms space race ultimately led to advancements for science and the US.
China's civil war was halted due to Japan's invasion of China, but resurged with full momentum after Japan's fall after World War II. China was split into two groups, the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao Zedong. The US sent the nationalist support because they were a former war ally, and it was the US's hope to stopping the spread of communism in China. After a string of communist victories and decreasing support of the US to the nationalists, China finally fell to communism in 1949.
It was China's fault and thus the failure of containment that also contributed to the Second Red Scare in the US. For the next 20 years, there was little to no diplomatic relations and trade between the US and China. It was not until the 1970s in which Nixon pursued the policy of détente, or relaxed tensions, and he visited China to normalize the relationship. They established this by agreeing on an acceptance of a one-China policy, implying the lesson commitment in recognizing the independence of Taiwan.
At the same time, Nixon's visitation alarmed the Soviet Union and made them pursue policies of détente, such as SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Vietnam was initially split in a communist north led by Ho Chi Minh and a nationalist south led by Ngo Dinh. The Soviet and the Chinese were not able to directly help the North Vietnamese, as Nixon had great diplomatic relationships on them. On the other hand, the US was able to aid the nationalists in the South militarily and financially. The US could not achieve the speedy victory the public had expected, so the public support of the war began to drop. Also, college students were initially the heart of this anti-war support. Nixon continued the policy of containment to prevent the aggressive push towards the northern communists and continued to lose more American lives, pride, and support. Nixon tried to maintain his support by following an armistice, but he soon began to secretly bomb the neutral Laos and Cambodia without letting the rest of America know. This was exposed in the releasing of the Pentagon Papers, and Nixon's Watergate scandal helped to increase the distrust in the American government. Thus, this led to less support in the policy of containment in Vietnam, and Ford lost the war in Vietnam when Congress did not allow any more aid to South Vietnam. This is a loss in the US's policy of containment as the communists forcibly reunited Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh.
Policy of containment is shown in the Korean War to stop military aggression by North Koreans. This allowed the first combined military force of the UN to step in with a majority of the support coming from America. This war was a back-and-forth war as the US assisted the South and the Chinese assisted the North until they were stalemated at the 38th parallel North. This shows some success and failure in the policy of containment of communism, as the North turned communist and the South remained democratic. Some effects were a Second Red Scare, and it made many Americans question the US's power and influence in the world. U.S. conquest in the Middle East can also be a part of the U.S. policy of containment, as the U.S. wanted to secure the vast oil supplies so the Soviets and their communism could not grow militarily and economically. The The US also wanted to dominate the oil supplies themselves, as the US was heavily dependent on oil. Oil was important for domestic and factory use, and could be used to power and create more military goods. This failed for the US when they formed OPEC, that dominated oil supplies and prices. The US also was pro-Israel, so they wanted to assist their ally in the Middle East with military and financial aid. Some examples of the US policy to contain communism in the Middle East can be shown with the Eisenhower Doctrine, which gave the US large loans to Turkey and Greece so their governments could fight off communist encroachment. US involvement in Latin America can best be seen in Nicaragua and Cuba. Carter initially supported the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, but the Sandinistas turned anti-US when Reagan came to the presidency. This led Reagan to indirectly support the Contras, who fought and rebelled against the Sandinistas in power of the Nicaragua government. Congress did not support the Contras, which led Reagan to make secret dealings in the Iran-Contra affair. The US would secretly sell arms to Iran to fight Iraq, which was thought to be a terrorist local nation, and they would give these profits to the Contras to fight the Sandinistas. In Cuba, conflict arose when Castro overthrew the US-backed dictator Batista from power. Also, tensions grew further when Cuba began to favor the Soviets' economic assistance over the US's, which led the US to retract its assistance and push Cuba further to communism. The US began to embargo Cuba